Herzlich willkommen zurück zum Tag der Konrad-Adenauer.
Welcome back to the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation Open Day. Since 1 p.m. we have been broadcasting from Berlin. Miguel and I accompanied you through the discussions on different topics. We went to Karlsruhe, Berlin, and Singapore. Miguel, what have you learned today? Yes, I mean, our fans know the foundation already pretty well, and I know it pretty well too. Yet it was interesting to see how many different topics the Adenauer Foundation focuses on and connects. We're starting the evening debate with Armin Laschet and Professor Armin Nassehi, chaired by Mariam Lau. But before that, we will have an introductory speech by Professor Norbert Lammert. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you very cordially from the Academy of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation in Berlin to the last round. And if everything goes well, welcome to the highlight of this year's KAS Open Day, a very traditional event that we conduct every year in order to communicate to our old and new customers, so to speak, and to draw their attention to different topics. These days were called open days and are called open days, a term that we would have to replace last year because of Corona, we had to deal with rather closed days and closed doors. And this is why I would like to use the opportunity, and this, by the way, is the only one, to thank all members, all employees, also to the two of you for preparing this open day and for this digital offer that you have made to talk about and discuss these topics and initiatives. And you who are watching this on your screens, I would like to thank for your interest, connected with the hope that we can see each other again, meet each other in person. For this last round, we're going to focus on a topic which is admittedly not totally new, politics and trust. However, this topic in particular, because of the pandemic experience, it has become extremely topical with regards to different yet same facets. And if I may make a general comment before we start. It is probably a slight exaggeration, if at all, if you point out that we, in the history of mankind, have never been dependent on a mutual basic trust. Because when it comes to all earlier phases of the history of mankind, you would be able to claim that humans were independent and were able to control their lives independently and alone. Today, we live in societies where more and more people conduct fewer and fewer activities based on their own competence and independence, and where they totally rely upon the fact that things are working. That sort of goes without saying for them, from opening the tap in the morning before you start taking a shower, up to programming the digital alarm clock before you go to bed in the evening. And this also refers to most of the things that happen during the day. People rely upon the functionality of framework conditions, whose functionality nobody could actually explain, never mind produce out of their own competence and power. Now, a prerequisite for this is that you have trust, that you trust what you use and have, that you can rely upon people, that you can rely upon the functioning of systems, and that you can also trust that institutions do the job that they are supposed to do. And vice versa, it is also true. As trust emerges from the experience that you have to deal with people that you can rely upon, that you can trust, and you have a system that you assume would work. Equally quickly, trust gets lost if you see that you can't rely upon systems or people anymore. Systems are not working. And if that is the case, trust gets lost. And this sort of deprives modern civilization of its foundation, i.e. mutual trust. Whether this is true and to what extent this is true, we would like to find out tonight. We have very competent panelists tonight, the Minister President of North Rhine-Westphalia and the Chairman of the CDU Germany, Armin Laschet, and Professor Nassehi, a sociologist from Munich. And the work of the Adenauer Foundation was critically accompanied by her because she is the fellow of the Adenauer Foundation 2020-2021. Of course, both have a totally different access to this topic. The topic of gaining trust, of losing trust in our society, and what the role is that policymakers play and have to play. Thank you to Mariam Lau, who is going to moderate this discussion here tonight. And I would like to pass the microphone to her. And yeah, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Lammert. Our societies are as free as never before, yet more and more people lose trust in democratic institutions. Many believe that the right answer to this would be more transparency and more participation. I'm not so sure that this is true, but I think that the Minister President of North Rhine-Westphalia, the chairman of the CDU Germany, is going to push us into the right direction when it comes to this topic. And then we're going to have a debate here on the panel, and then the audience should also get a chance to ask questions and make comments. Mr. Laschet, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Lau, Armin Nassehi, Norbert Lammert. Politics and trust, they belong together, at least in a democracy they do, and even more so in a representative democracy, such as the German one. Democracy thrives on trust, not unconditional trust, but a very basic trust. Trust in persons, in people, in politicians, a trust in institutions, and a trust in processes, in rules and regulations. And these rules apply to everyone. The rules are written down in the basic law and in other laws. And even in times of a pandemic, the basic rights and the rules of our constitution apply. The constitution and the basic rights have not been suspended. Our constitution has applied, but under crisis conditions. During the pandemic, we have seen how quickly and how intensely trust can change. Norbert Lammert just mentioned it. There has hardly ever been a time in which people felt or experienced the impact of politics in their everyday life. And that wasn't just a few groups, but everyone, all 83 million people in Germany had to follow, experience measures taken by the German state. Citizens saw the press conferences, the minister-president conferences. They may not do that as often anymore in the future, but they did in order to figure out whether their children could go to school the very next day, whether they could go to their office, whether they would be allowed to open up their business or plan a trip or go traveling, or even just go outside. Politics all of a sudden became something that wasn't abstract anymore, that wasn't situated somewhere far away in Berlin or Brussels, but rather it was something that affected and changed everybody's everyday lives. And throughout the first months of the pandemic, trust into the governing bodies and politicians, crisis managers, did grow despite significant limitations of citizens' freedoms and rights. People did accept those decisions. And after some weeks, a lot of measures could be suspended once again. And citizens saw that our democracy worked. Our democracy brought us throughout the crisis, but there were also critical tones in this phase. Throughout the second and third wave, things were quite different. Trust sank. There were mistakes that happened. Decisions were taken and then revised. Processes didn't work quite as well as in the beginning. And again, that is part of democracy, self-correction. A lot of people were very impressed when our federal chancellor said, "We made a mistake, we will correct it." That was a few days before Easter, with the so-called Easter break. But even admitting to mistakes creates trust, because it is human to err. And if you admit to mistakes, the trust is there for the next decision to be made. And if things go wrong again, they will tell us. They will not hide when things go wrong. And that's the strength of a democratic system. An autocratic leader would not do that. Even if there had been a mistake, they would not admit to it. And we saw that our federal system proved its worth. In a central state, one person decides for the entire country, and if the decision is wrong, there is no corrective. The federalism offered the opportunity for the Länder to reach conclusions, even if this sometimes was an arduous process. And a lot of ideas on how to master crises came from mayors from Rostock or from Tübingen, from other cities. People who had already gained the trust of people locally. They ended up being the mediators between those affected by the measures and the state deciding upon those measures. And we have to ask ourselves, and that is the topic of today, how can this trust come about? How do we get good governance? And I think I can say now that things are going well, now that we have a high vaccination rate, now that incidences are going down, a lot of people will say, well, we were quite annoyed in between, but we realized we have still mastered this crisis rather well. And the challenges that are ahead of us now are at least as gigantic as the pandemic itself. Climate change, structural change that comes with it, or that's happening in its own right, demographic change, digitization of work life, of school life, and society, an aging society, and the problem of pensions. Lots of things that will affect people's lives that require us to trust in those who make the laws and who make the decisions. Democracy also means balancing of interests. One decision affects others. And we have to find compromises once and once again. Consensus being the currency of political action is something Armin Nassehi sometimes once said. Of course, we would like to have 140 characters spelling out all the messages that we want to send out, because our world has changed, our medial world has changed, but we still have to stay on course to make action visible is, I think, what can create trust even in such a fast-paced world, especially if there are groups who are more and more aggressively questioning the state and the concept of democracy, and that don't really accept that there is a problem, be it because you say Corona doesn't exist, be it because you say climate change doesn't exist, be it denying other problems in society. And therefore, it is important to maintain trust in the center, to keep arguing and discussing, and to keep this awake in order to strengthen trust in democracy. Thank you very much, Mr. Laschet. I think you have given us quite a lot of food for thought here. Allow me to go back to last Sunday. You mentioned it already. The CDU is doing better in the forecasts. Sachsen-Anhalt was the election results were a success, but we have to talk about politics and trust in the CDU as well. What happened there? Well, that were very special elections, because the danger was there that for the first time since the Second World War, a right-wing party would have taken power and would have become the strongest party in a federal, in a Länder parliament. Would have even maybe presented the minister president. And I think the citizens felt that. And in this land and in this time, trust is so important. The people in Eastern Germany witnessed huge change in 1990. On the 1st of July in 1990, they had the Deutsche Mark. A lot of people slipped into joblessness, had no more pension. And structural change over 40 years that we saw in the West, in industrial area of the Ruhr, for example, didn't happen. And some people are careful with regard to change. Now we have another change, which is withdrawal from the coal period, from coal mining. And so we need a plan to make sure the region doesn't suffer, to make sure that there are new jobs. And Rainer Haseloff, the minister president, is a person who deserves this trust and who is credible. Yes, without just wanting to talk about this one federal state, let me say something on that. He is someone who said we won't let Berlin tell us what to do. We won't have others tell us what to do. We had Rainer Haseloff. I don't want to talk about him all the time, but during the pandemic, he sometimes didn't agree with what the federal government did or wanted. So again, there was a certain mistrust towards those up there. And in the CDU, we have a certain mistrust. I could also mention Friedrich Merz, who played with that. So has this taken root? Has mistrust or distrust taken root in the CDU as well? Well, no. But, well, yes, he won the election because, well, he has his own conviction that he presented in the minister-president conferences, and he was consequent. And I think you can trust someone also who contradicts. Mr. Nassehi, some say the exit from this dilemma is more transparency and more participation. Is that true? No, I don't think so. From a sociologist point of view, I would say trust can be measured by the fact that we don't want to know everything, be it in private lives. If my wife, for example, would want to know what I do every second of the day when I'm not in Munich, that would point to the fact that she doesn't trust me. I mean, this is not just about private lives. But if we are in situations where we want to know everything, then there is no trust. Mr. Lammert just talked about the difference between personal trust and systemic trust. And I think last week during the elections, we could see that there was a certain anomaly that in the political system, those who are currently in the opposition aren't loyal to the proceedings or to the procedures. And that is dangerous. Democracy doesn't mean the government of the majority, because then a lynching mob would also be that. And if there was consensus only, then we wouldn't need democracy. The non-majority, the minority, they have to be included as well. And that is the art. So in a democracy, the political actors are not enemies, they are competitors, they are opponents, whatever you would like to call them. And this anomaly is a huge problem. If there is such a situation, then you want total transparency. And that's risky to say, because you could interpret it to say he doesn't want transparency. He wants those politicians to be doing things behind closed doors and be intransparent. Not at all. But if we were to know everything, we could never have structures of politics, of economy, of traffic. So, for example, I took the train to Berlin and I trusted there to be a trained train driver rather than a sociologist or minister president at the wheel. So, of course, we need to have trust. And in crisis situations, we look more closely. The pandemic showed it. We wanted to know everything. You got up in the morning, you looked at your phone, you wanted to know about the incidences, the numbers, although we don't even know what those figures actually mean. And then some clever people come and say, maybe it doesn't mean what you think it does. And then somebody else says, well, maybe that's not really true. And then we were all experts of everything. We know nothing and lose trust. And the so-called Querdenker are riding on that wave. How much participation and how much transparency do we want in elections within a party? When your nomination was about to happen, there was the demand from within the party to make this a grassroots event. The Americans did it, the Republicans, and we know what happened afterwards. What do you think? The more participation and transparency, the better? Your nomination is thanks to the decision of the party. We have representative bodies. Well, I think transparency can be interpreted in different ways. The decision pathways for the one or the other must be transparent. The question as to how do we get to a decision is a basic one, is an essential one. Federal German democracy after 1949 has drawn its strength on being a representative democracy, that the people vote for MPs, not the chancellor, him or herself, but rather MPs, and then the parliament will vote for a chancellor. Presidial systems are doing it differently. You vote for a person. That may not be a wrong thing, but Germany has lived its model in a rather successful way, and that also refers to or relates to parties. There are 1,001 delegates voting for the chairman or the chairwoman, who in turn have been deployed by their local bodies. And that offers the opportunity for all regions of Germany to be present, that consensus is possible within certain bodies or committees. If I have a conflict, how do we design the care system? We have a Christian and socialist point of view, but we also have an economic point of view. And I cannot solve this conflict with a grassroots decision. I need to have representatives from, for example, the industry and from other bodies, and then we sit together and find a conclusion. The same way for a parliament, especially the European Parliament, because you can find majorities beyond borders and beyond parties. So again, representation works towards consensus, and the German parliament does the same. And I think this representative democracy is better than a democracy of opinions. So you adhere to the principle of leadership. Throughout the pandemic, there were two antipodes. One was you saying, let us look at other points of view, not just virologists. Let's ask sociologists or lawyers. Let's hear their perspective. And your opponent, Markus Söder, looked more towards leadership and this way, please. No. I don't think it sounds different.
The first question is, do you make decisions based on poll outcomes or atmospheres or moods? Or do you make decisions if you deem them correct and after that hope and try to get a majority? The core issues of post-war Germany hardly had a majority in the population when they were virulent. I don't think that everybody was in favor of social market economy in 1949. For the alliance towards the West and then the Eastern politics, a huge dispute between the CDU, SPD and FDP at the time. Then rearmament up to migration policy, up to the introduction of the euro. Again and again, people in the end said, yes, it was good and right that you did it like that. It has to be decided, but then also explained. And the issue regarding the pandemic is slightly different. In fact, there was more trust because there was a crisis. Those who said, this is how it is, and I'm going to close everything. I mean, if people hear, okay, he's going to close everything, it's clear. If somebody says, well, let's see whether we have to close the schools, what will be the impact on students, then this seems less clear than somebody who prohibits things. Yet I think it was the right approach and reasonable. Well, the question is, are we discussing the content or the structure? And if we take this case, then of course, the question of what the Bavarian minister president or the North Rhine-Westphalian minister president have done during the pandemic was very different. But no matter what you did, it was, of course, also observed with regards to the political issue. You could not run away from this. And this is how politics works. How the chancellor candidate says here is always measured, not just based on the content, but also measured on the different forces within his party. This is the problem of politics. It's not just about technical issues, but it's also about other things. And people know this. This is not something that you should criticize. This is part of the game. It's exciting because we are dealing with procedures. If the procedures are questioned, then it becomes difficult to have leadership. There are different styles of leadership. I mean, we have gotten used to Angela Merkel's leadership style. This is a very specific form, which might be different from other chancellors. Leading from behind, yes, from behind, but also with regards to the fact that it is less balancing and offsetting than upon sacrifice of participation of those who can also have a say. I mean, there are different styles and both are legitimate. What I'm heading at is the following. What does participation actually mean? So both forms, and I would also say the form of North Rhine-Westphalia versus Bavaria during the pandemic, are styles, different styles. Both show that you don't assume that there is something like total participation demanded. This would be populism. And in countries where you have populist leaders, we see that those who are on top talk about the establishment. This is so paradox. The establishment talks against the establishment. At the same time, they claim that they speak on behalf of the entire people. I, as a sociologist, would say that democracy is also an algorithm to prevent democracy from happening, so that not everybody can participate at any time on each and every issue. Is it possible to, for instance, focus on long-term issues? So the issues that have just been mentioned, the big issues of the Federal Republic of Germany. So you also have to implement things. I mean, when it comes to politics, it's also about power. And power, on the one hand, means implementing and executing the existing policies, but power also means executing specific topics. If you are a political leader, you have to actually execute your topics. And if you are successful, then you see that you can exercise this power. Everything is intertwined. Naive observers say, if everybody had a say, you would find the best compromise. But let me tell you, wouldn't find any compromise. And I think this is the strength of democracy, that styles are different, goes without saying. Otherwise, we wouldn't have elections and we wouldn't have a choice. Now, this is a bit too comfortable and sounds a bit too cozy if I look into the CDU. Well, the number of people in the party who demand more leadership and who also show mistrust against the ones up there, the party chairmanship, the party leadership. There's much more tension in there than it sounds here, isn't there? Well, this is what parties are there for. Parties have a civilizing function because they are major organizations and are thus able to more or less bundle these things. It has become more difficult nowadays because conflicts are less transparent. By the way, there are other big and major organizations who take a different approach, a similar approach. Churches had a similar civilizing impact. Churches can be very wild if they are not contained in organizations. So things have become more complex and difficult. And this applies to potentially all parties. The CDU, after 16 years of a very continuous leadership style, now has a chance to make other conflict lines visible, and they are becoming visible. And sometimes it is about more than just style questions. Yeah, I totally agree. But I mean, this is the inner party conflict, and this is why they are there. And it becomes visible. I mean, you cannot accuse the CDU of not making these things visible. Yes, they have become visible, but they haven't been solved yet. What has not been solved yet? Well, this tension between, do you recognize representation? No, I think that has been solved. It was a cumbersome path. These were cumbersome days. Let me put it like this. We're talking 8 to 10 days. 8 to 10 days regarding a question which is highly relevant, a question that was never posed if a chancellor was there and was willing to continue. For 16 years, this was not an issue. 16 years, it was almost not an issue with Helmut Kohl. Once there was the attempt to replace him, but the moment that CDU and CSU have to agree only occurs if a new chapter is starting. And this has always been disputed. I mean, Edmund Stoiber and Angela Merkel, or Helmut Kohl and Helmut Strauss, I mean, there was not always harmony. Nowadays, it's even more a bit harmonious than at the time. But the question is, does that solve the problem? Well, we are in June now. The decision was made at the end of April. So look at how the atmosphere has changed in Germany and take a look at the Greens. It seemed that there would be a Green chancellor, and all of a sudden we have a totally different political atmosphere. And this should not be the category, therefore. How is the current atmosphere? The category has to be a different one. And if you ask me regarding the CDU, my impression is that people now support what has been agreed upon. You just mentioned the big challenges of the Federal Republic of Germany, alliance with the West, Eastern policy, introduction of the euro. Now we are potentially confronted with the next big upheaval, that is climate change. I think you can say that the Greens are actually the only party at the moment that clearly says your life has to radically change. My impression is that the CDU subscribed to that, but what this means is still unclear. The CDU still says and suggests, yeah, you continue to drive cars, you can continue to eat meat, you can continue to fly, you can continue business as usual. Don't you shy away from confronting the reality? I only trust policymakers if they are willing to say unpleasant things and if they tell inconvenient things. We used to say you have to fasten your seatbelt more, but isn't this also something that the CDU has to confront now? Well, the basic question is, can you only solve the problem by sacrificing everything and everything becomes worse? Is that the answer? And the Greens, you say they are more credible. They don't say this. The Trittin government said in the past, 1 liter of gas should cost 5 Deutschmarks. It wasn't meant like this. No, we didn't mean it like this. No, the 16 cents were raised by you. Hold on, you say the Greens say this, but they don't say it. Their agenda and program is very smooth because they probably know that the approach of you all have to sacrifice, you have to stop flying, you have to stop eating meat is not helpful to the Greens either. And now I'm talking about the Greens. And then the next question is it actually necessary? Or do we have a different approach, like myself? Can we use innovation, research, and technologies and make sure that we are mobile in the future, get from A to B quickly, yet can comply with the climate protection goals? And I don't think that we can only achieve this with drama, with sacrifice, and everything has to change. You can argue about this, of course. I mean, there are colleagues who have a totally different point of view. And I once talked to one and he said, well, he's saying, well, there won't be any cars in the city anymore and everything will be wonderful if there are no cars in the city anymore. It's less noisy, less traffic. And the enjoyment of what you preach as sacrifice normally is actually the blessing of the future. But if you don't believe this, if you believe in e-cars driving through city centers, zero emissions that you don't hear anymore, which is only used for small paths, then this is also a solution and there is a dissent. Yes. It is so complex, this topic. So both is true and not true. This is so crazy about this. I mean, of course, there is this challenge and we have to master it. It's there. And globally, it will also play a decisive role. So we have to face and confront this challenge. Democracies will not be able to make decisions against people's everyday interests. And I don't believe in the Protestant principle of sacrifice, that things are only good if they are painful. Yet, this doesn't mean that we have a concept already. I think we have to start small because we are talking trust here. So how can we make sure that people don't fly from Munich to Berlin? This is banal, but it's not banal if you ask yourself, are we doing this through conviction? Are we doing this through prohibitions? And by the way, nobody really wants this in the political world because then they won't be elected. Or do you set up an infrastructure where you don't even come up with the idea to fly from Munich to Berlin? This sounds totally banal, but it is connected to huge political decisions. And in Germany, we are lagging behind when it comes to these infrastructure stories. The wonderful train track that was built from Munich to Berlin wasn't unfortunately built in a way that it's really worth using it. And leadership would make sure that these things are implemented. And we know from democracy research that convictions are normally not there because of insights, the idea of insights into necessities. This is what academics say. We are now explaining to you how this works, and then you do it. No, we have to integrate this into people's everyday lives. And by the way, this also applies to the big issues. The big social democratic decade, the 1970s, they worked because they needed social upswing, also for economic reasons. And it meant total turbulence for people, and it then created framework conditions where this was possible. And to create these framework conditions is what we need. So it's not the alternative to say, are we going to do it or not, or sacrifice yes or no. We need intelligent solutions. And this, in fact, is set beyond political borders. I think no matter which political forms you want to implement, what is missing at the moment is the classical political conflicts. So the climate issue, I mean, if you take the old antipodes, cannot be solved conservative versus social democratically anymore, and conservative versus green doesn't work anymore either, because the overlaps are way too big. So it goes to the acting people. You need to create concepts that result in trust, and you can only create trust if you offer livable alternatives. Everything takes time. We know this already. It's not the only challenge we are confronted with. The digitization issue needs to be dealt with much faster than is the case in Germany or Europe. Others are passing us geopolitically. And of course, we have the demography issue in the whole of Europe. This is going to be a huge challenge to master as well. And we only develop long-term solutions. They are not sexy. You cannot say, here, I'm offering this, and next August it will materialize. So you need trust to make sure that people can be sorted out in the background. This is leadership. And when it comes to democracy theory, we end up in very difficult situations. How do you teach people to have stamina, to be patient, although a volatile society cannot have that stamina?
That brings us to an interesting point. What about politicians' trust into the citizens? During the pandemic, we often saw a discussion saying, oh, we can't really let our people suffer anymore. We can't ask this of the citizen anymore, even though very often surveys showed that the citizens would have taken even harsher measures or accepted. Let me answer in two parts, building up on something Armin Nassehi said. The challenge of climate change is one that's not leaving us a lot of time. And some people deduct from that, not parties, but thinkers deduct from that. The measures taken during the corona pandemic are the measures we need to combat climate change. And then they question democratic processes because it takes too long with all the committee meetings and the press conferences, etc., etc. So we need an authoritarian decision because this is about the fate of mankind. And if that's how you see things, that's a danger to democracy as we know it. Therefore, I think we need to use the arguments of our democracy to create such trust to bring about change. And the same applies to the pandemic. China was much quicker in overcoming the virus because it implemented a very strong social surveillance scheme to see who's wearing the mask and who's not. But this is not our free model, our model of freedom. And we must show that with our model, we can fight both the pandemic as well as the climate change. Secondly, was a majority in favor or against measures? Well, we are in an expert council where we have a psychologist on board who analyzed the Germans and their mindset. And then you can see there are people who are differently impacted. A part who works in the public sector, for example, well, you know, for them, it was a good life. They said, oh, life is less fast. I stay at home. I see the kids. I can do stuff in my garden, and I can go to the DIY store and do things I don't have the time for. I had time to read books, etc. The other part of society had existential needs. Artists, exhibitors at trade fairs, people who couldn't open their businesses, who were supported with millions of euros, but still were threatened. And then to make a decision towards the one or for the one against the other, that was a really difficult thing. And then, of course, there was the competition between Munich and Düsseldorf. From my perspective, it wasn't there. I simply had a different opinion. But this whole competition or talk about who's going to be the candidate for the chancellery, this is not what I was interested in throughout those months. I knew my position is the less popular one, but I thought it was right and it was important. But people kept talking about, oh, they've been arguing again. Somebody said something against someone, and it was all forced into that corset. And I think topics need to be discussed beyond or outside of the suspicion that whatever you say is just tactic. My thesis was not that that's the case. No, that's how people perceived it, exactly. And that is one of the challenges of politics. Of course, it may have been partly like that, and that's not wrong. What I find interesting with this example is that there were new forms of steering or control. We discussed the question, what does it mean, risk adequate forms of opening up? What does that mean? And without patting ourselves on the shoulders, we can say we were the first to actually develop such a concept. And the interesting thing, this goes back to the question you asked. As soon as you have a project, sort of a step-by-step plan, for example, that needs 4 weeks to unfold, society just started its engine and was quicker. It was not about trusting citizens. It was the question of how can we steer or control. As academics, we're really great to take a white sheet of paper and writing down who's supposed to do what, when, and where. But societal dynamics are much more complex. That is, of course, the abstract answer of a sociologist. But therefore, I do not believe in just authoritarian alternatives. A lot of people said during the first lockdown, look, the executive is successful if it wants to. But for me, that was a very threatening sentence because that would have been the end of deliberation. But on the other hand, to say you cannot do anything because people do not want to be steered, you can't do that either. Intelligent steering or control. Well, it's easy to say that for an academic, and to practically implement that, you need concepts, of course. We tried. I think some things were good because we counted on having to have trust in the actors on board, but it was difficult. I witnessed one change throughout that time. I always had a certain skepticism towards those who do models, who model things, who said, well, 80 million Germans, we have to reduce contacts. And if we tweak this, or if we don't allow that, it'll give us another 2%. Or if we reduce public transport, another 5%. If we close down schools, another 20%. That's how they worked. And for the first and also the second wave, it worked. But those who did the modeling said themselves that it did no longer work for the third wave because people act differently. And I thought that was a bit relaxing, actually, that you can't use a mathematical model to steer the life decisions of more than 80 million people. So once again, there was a situation around Easter. Politicians thought, oh dear, but the chancellor said, I have to think. And then she thought and nothing happened. And people, nevertheless, and that's what those who did the modeling got wrong. People acted more carefully than they thought. And then that's why the numbers went down. Well, you have to know about the lives of the people. Rainer Haseloff told me that, actually. They had opened schools in southern Saxon-Anhalt and ran tests 3 times a week. Now they decide to close the schools, and the effect is apparently a hard measure, but because you don't test anymore, but the children keep meeting up with one another in private because they are children. So despite the hard measures, there was a higher risk because the tests weren't taking place. But people who do the modeling don't factor that in. They say less contacts at school, lower numbers. But private behavior of people is not factored in. But I think they still did a great job because you had to calculate, seeing how can we reduce contacts, where are things happening. I would like to come to a close because we have to enter the final round of our discussion. So trust of voters into politicians and politicians trusting voters. Let us now briefly talk about trust among one another. An American politologist, Robert Putnam, had a thesis: the more diverse a society, the smaller trust or mutual trust. Is that correct? Yes. Putnam was talking about the typically American conflicts. The American society is, on the one hand, very homogeneous with regard to the idea of democracy, but very diverse with regard to ethnic groups. And we can't really compare that with our society. So the question is, what does diversity actually mean? We sometimes present our way of diversity in a negative light, or more negative than it actually is. So we are a migration society. We didn't want to be that for the longest time, an immigration society. And we are astonished that people in the second, third, or fourth generation of migration are actually there. Aladdin El-Mafalani has a thesis that I really approve of. When describing this paradoxon, he said, well, we have more conflicts in the public at the moment. That's because the children of migrants have arrived at the top of society. And that's an exciting thesis that I think we have to further develop. And we are doing something. Aladdin actually used that to, or did a relevant exercise in North Rhine-Westphalia in administration. It's not about diversity or non-diversity. The question is, can we find ways to deal with them? As an example, something you don't usually expect. If we imagine that in the generation of our parents, my parents are, I think we're more or less the same age, the divide between religions was as big as other problems that we face today. So denominational issues were a big topic, whereas students these days hardly know which religion did they belong to anymore. So societies become very inclusive, and then new conflicts come up. We have a big problem of racism. We have a big problem that things aren't going well, but we also have a problem that we don't recognize, that conflicts have arrived in the middle of society, and we can actually have discourses on diversity. I'm not as negative towards this. And it is a topic as well that is often considered the topic of society, but it is not. I think we don't have major integration problems in most areas of this country. I think in some areas, maybe they correlate with the opposition party that does not always adhere to our democratic principles or ideas of democracy. Anti-Semitism is strongest where the number of Jews is smallest. So Mr. Nassehi leads us to the question posed by a follower on Instagram. How do you want to make sure to have women, young people, or citizens with a migration background? How do you want to include them more? This is going to be an important question. Diversity and migration have been put together here. I think our society has become more diverse because the concepts of life of people are more diverse than they used to be a few decades ago. It's about men and women. It's about sexual orientation. It's different questions. And our society is diverse even without migration. People are going their own way. So how can a party reflect this or mirror this? Well, we don't do it enough. The age average of CDU is 60.8 8. That's the average. So a lot of them are older. 75% are men. In a country where 25% of people have a migration background or a migration biography, we only have a minimal share of them as members of our party. So it does not reflect or mirror our party. So the question is, who makes decisions? Who sets up MPs? The CDU member is not typical for the CDU voter. The CDU voter is not representative of society. But if we wanted to build a bridge into society and win majorities, we have to take a broader look at society. And then we have to see how can we foster those groups who are not represented enough, women, young people, people with migration background. Is this something that you will use your team for? Well, we'll have to see which team will be set up when. But this is a question that goes beyond this election. How can a party continue to be a mirror of society? How can a major party represent society? We can't make politics for the entire society either. You have to put people there, and then at all levels, this has to happen at all levels, and there will be difficult debates about certain quotas or shares, but I'm not really in favor of that. I think it's a question of leadership. If you take someone on board who has potential, that will draw others along. For the CDU, many years ago, I gave a speech to the CSU parliamentary group, and back then, things were still a bit different. And I tried to take this apart and I said, look, there are people who are very much family oriented, they are conservative, they are religious. So aren't migrants, your thing? They may not have the highest education background either, I said very cheekily, but that was the CSU, so that was not your party, obviously. But it's interesting, people still talk to me about this because there was a certain click in their head saying, well, isn't it a rather conservative problem? They're migrant communities are not usually a unionist problem, as was discussed in the 70s and 80s. So there is a lot of potential, I think. This is something the party has to do from within itself, but society as a whole needs this as well. Economy, the industry. I think up until 10 years ago, the boards of German DAX companies didn't have a single woman, or maybe one. And those who were on the board, that elite research shows that they were sons of fathers who had already been there before. So you go to a certain school, you go to a certain university, you set up certain networks, you develop a certain habitus. And then if you go into interviews, you meet someone with a similar habitus and you say, well, they are similar to me, so that's who I'll go with. And there weren't any women and no migrants either. But those with a lower educational background weren't represented much either. And if we talk about the Federal Press Conference or the one of the Länder, there are hardly any women. There are no migrants. So again, the media, the press authorities and the press offices don't reflect or mirror society. We can't always have quotas for everything in society, but you need to keep an eye on that. And if you had diversity in a team, I always realized results were better in the end because there were different perspectives that you didn't have before, that you couldn't have had.
So a follower is asking, the tension between the fundamental right for demonstration and the jeopardizing of such procedures because of radical protests have emerged. For instance, right-wing extremists at the rallies against corona measures. So is there a chance to build trust in politics at all and counteract these developments. Yes, you have to counteract and intervene if health rules, are violated. Other than that, people can gather, and they're not all right-wing radicals. A lion's share of Corona rallies in Berlin were very colorful. We had esoterics, we had those who were against vaccinations, there were left and right people. To always say they were all right-wing extremists was too simple, but how they gather and if they play by the rules, yeah, as long as they play by the rules, I think the government should stay out and not intervene. Well, there is a pattern when protest occurs. So if protest is articulation forms outside of procedures, so if they are happening in the streets. And this pattern says that protest becomes more likely if protesters have the impression that the opposition is not able to be critical enough vis-a-vis those who make decisions. You can see this very well if you look at our country's history. Protests of the left and the right work pretty similarly. And of course, we have also noticed this during the pandemic. The biggest criticism basically was, and this is something that comes from the left-wing movements, they said CDU, CSU, SPD, FDP, Greens, they are all the same, which is of course not true. But from this perspective, it seems true. And I think this is a very dangerous development if protest sort of questions the procedures of democracy themselves. Other than that, protest is one of the most important democratic fundamental rights. Hence, it is very important and very correct. But you cannot really change this. This is not going to work. And I think that many of the protesters, when it comes to certain issues, have found themselves in contexts where they didn't want to be. As regards the Querdenker rallies, I mean, those who organized these rallies had very specific ideas and concepts that were tailored against democratic procedures. There was one rally here in Berlin where they said, we are now a constitutional assembly. That was the same day when there were people standing on the stairs of the Reichstag. We are a constitutional assembly, they said, so the state is illegitimate. And they even entered the Reichstag. Yeah, almost. I mean, this is, of course, beyond anything that's acceptable, and the state and the government, of course, has to use its means to fight this. We're talking about trust here. So if trust gets lost, trust in procedures, then we have a huge problem. In the US, this has been an issue. Quite a few things are still going to happen there. It's not just about two political concepts, but it's about the issue of legitimacy of democratic procedures, a huge issue. Yes. Perfect final statement. Yes, that was a very nice statement, a very nice and smooth sentence. Mr. Laschet, Mr. Nassehi, thank you so much for your input. Thank you, dear audience, for your interest. And our two moderators have the final word. Thank you very much. That was the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation Open Day. Thank you to all participants, to all panelists. Thank you, dear audience, for your interest. And if you have missed something, or if you want to watch a specific part again, there will be a live stream uploaded on kas.de. We are saying goodbye to you. Have a nice remaining evening.